The sound started at 5:47 a.m., a low rumble that Margaret Wilson felt in her chest, a surmises before she heard it with her ears. The vibration crawled through the floorboards of her small trailer, rattling the collection of chipped coffee mugs hanging above her sink. By 6 o'clock, the entire structure was shaking. The framed photo of her late husband Bill slid across the nightstand and would have crashed to the floor if Margaret hadn't caught it with weathered hands. Outside, the Arizona dawn painted the desert in shades of amber and gold. But something was wrong. The rumble had become a roar. Through thin curtains, Margaret saw flashes of chrome and leather. Headlights sliced through morning mist, forming a ring around her home. "Mom!" David's voice cracked with fear from the bedroom. "What's happening?" "Stay inside," Margaret commanded, tightening the belt of her faded robe. 16 years of motherhood had taught her to sound braver than she felt. "Lock the door." Through the window, she watched Mrs. Peterson from the next trailer over, frantically dialing 911, mouth moving in silent panic. Margaret stepped onto her small porch, the metal door creaking behind her. The cold desert air bit through her thin robe. What she saw made her blood freeze. Motorcycles. Hundreds of them. Harleys arranged in a perfect circle around the entire trailer park. Men in leather vests stood beside their bikes, arms crossed, faces like stone. The morning sun glinted off their chrome and patches. Hell's Angels, the feared motorcycle club, had surrounded her home. A giant of a man with a scar running from temple to jaw detached from the group. He walked toward Margaret with deliberate steps, carrying a worn leather bag. The sea of bikers parted to let him through. His eyes never left hers. Margaret stood perfectly still, mind racing through every possible reason why hundreds of bikers would surround her home at dawn. None of the scenarios ended well. As the scarred man drew closer, Margaret thought about her son inside, about the baseball bat behind her door, about how fast she could get to it. The man stopped 10 feet away. For a long, terrible moment, neither spoke. Then he smiled. 48 hours earlier, the Last Mile Diner sat like a time capsule along Route 66, its neon sign flickering against the cloudless Arizona sky. Once a thriving establishment during the highway's golden age, it now survived on nostalgic tourists and long-haul truckers who remembered when this stretch of road meant something. Margaret Wilson had been pouring coffee here for 17 years. At 54, her once auburn hair now showed generous streaks of silver pulled back in a practical ponytail. Laugh lines framed eyes that had seen their share of hardship but refused to surrender their warmth. "Order up," Dale Fisher barked from the kitchen window, sliding a plate of eggs and hash browns onto the counter. Margaret grabbed the plate, noting how the eggs were overcooked again. Dale had been running the diner for 30 years, and somehow his cooking had gotten worse with time. At 62, the former Gulf War soldier had the disposition of a man perpetually disappointed with the world. "Table 4 extra hot sauce," Margaret announced, setting the plate before a truck driver whose name she'd never learned, but whose order she knew by heart. The diner's interior hadn't changed since the 70s. Vinyl booths in faded turquoise, chrome-edged tables, a jukebox that only played songs from before 1975 because Dale refused to update it. "Music stopped being music after that," he'd growl whenever the subject arose. Margaret moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups, wiping spills, listening to snippets of conversation. This was her world. These four walls had witnessed her joys and sorrows for nearly 2 decades. They'd seen her meet Bill, a handsome Navy veteran who'd stopped for pie and ended up staying for Margaret. They'd seen her work through her pregnancy with David right up until her water broke during the lunch rush. And they'd seen her return 3 days after Bill's funeral, eyes hollow, but spine straight, because the bills wouldn't pay themselves. "Taking my break, Dale," Margaret called toward the kitchen as the lunch rush subsided. She slipped into the back alley where a three-legged mutt waited patiently by the dumpster. "Hello, Charlie," she said softly, setting down a plate of hamburger scraps she'd saved from the lunch service. "Good day today?" The dog wagged his tail, his eyes never leaving the food. Margaret had discovered him behind the diner 3 years ago, emaciated and injured. She'd nursed him back to health, using tips she couldn't really spare for vet bills and dog food. Dale had threatened to call animal control, until Margaret reminded him that Charlie kept the rats away. It wasn't entirely true, but Dale had begrudgingly allowed the arrangement to continue. "Margaret," Dale's voice carried from inside. "Phone call." Margaret sighed, giving Charlie a final pat before heading back inside. The call was from David's school. His calculus teacher wanted to discuss his potential for an engineering scholarship. Pride swelled in her chest. Her son possibly the first in their family to attend college. The pride was quickly tempered by reality. Scholarship or not, there would be expenses. Books, housing, meals. The $1,243 she'd managed to save over 3 years seemed pitifully inadequate when measured against her son's future. That evening, Margaret walked the 3 miles home, as she did every day, her feet aching in shoes that needed replacing. Her ancient Chevy sat useless in the trailer park's small lot, its transmission finally giving up 6 weeks ago. The repair estimate of $1,700 might as well have been $1 million. The desert sunset painted the mountains in purple and gold as Margaret trudged along the shoulder of the highway cars whizzing past. Some days, the beauty of it all still took her breath away, even after decades in Arizona. Bill had promised they'd drive the entire Route 66 someday from Chicago to California. "Just you and me, Maggie," he'd say. "America's Main Street." He died before they could make the trip. Margaret arrived home to find David hunched over textbooks at their small kitchen table. At 16, he already stood taller than his father had, with the same serious blue eyes and determined jaw. "How was school?" she asked, setting down her purse and slipping off her shoes with a grateful sigh. David looked up, his face brightening. "Mr. Callahan thinks I have a shot at the West Ridge Engineering Scholarship." "Full ride, Mom." Margaret beamed, masking the worry beneath. Full ride meant tuition. But what about everything else? "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I always knew you were brilliant. Just like Dad," David said quietly. Margaret nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. "Just like your father." She didn't tell David about the latest collection notice that had arrived that morning. Another reminder of the $78,000 in medical debt left behind when Bill's heart gave out 3 years ago. The insurance company had denied most of the claims, citing a pre-existing condition that Bill never knew he had. Margaret didn't tell David that she slept on the couch so he could have the trailer's only bedroom. She didn't mention that she'd been skipping lunch to save a few dollars a day. And she certainly didn't tell him that sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, she wondered how much longer she could keep their world from falling apart. Instead, she smiled and asked about his calculus test, listening intently as he explained concepts she couldn't begin to understand, but was immensely proud he did. Later that night, after David had gone to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table counting out bills by the dim light above the sink. Rent, electricity, phone. Each envelope got its meager share, never enough to pay in full, but enough to keep the services on for another month. The medical bills went into a separate pile. Those would have to wait. From a hollowed-out cookbook that had belonged to Bill's mother, Margaret extracted the $1,243 she'd managed to save. Emergency money, college money, Future money. She counted it carefully, then returned it to its hiding place. Tomorrow was Tuesday, which meant old Mr. Henderson would be at the diner. The retired judge suffered from dementia and came in every week to tell Margaret the same story about how he met his wife at a USO dance in 1952. Margaret always listened as if hearing it for the first time. She turned out the light and made her bed on the couch, wincing as the broken spring jabbed her back. Through the thin walls, she could hear David's soft snoring. For him, she'd endure anything. Sleep came fitfully haunted by numbers that didn't add up, and dreams of Bill standing on Route 66 beckoning her toward a horizon she couldn't reach. Tuesday afternoon brought unusual stillness to the Last Mile diner. A rare lull between lunch and dinner allowed Margaret to wipe down tables and refill salt shakers. Dale was in the back office grumbling over invoices. Linda, the other waitress, had called in sick again, leaving Margaret to handle the floor alone. Mr. Henderson had come and gone, telling his USO story twice today. Margaret had given him extra pie and listened with genuine affection. At precisely 3:47 p.m., the quiet was shattered by the distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines. Not one or two, but several growing louder as they approached the diner. Margaret looked up to see 5 Harley-Davidsons pull into the parking lot. The riders dismounted with the stiff movements of men who'd been on the road too long. They removed their helmets, revealing faces weathered by sun and wind. Each wore a leather vest adorned with patches, the most prominent being the distinctive Death's Head insignia of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The elderly couple in booth 3 immediately asked for their check. The salesman by the window closed his laptop and began gathering his things. The woman reading a paperback left a $5 bill for her $2 coffee and hurried toward the door. Within minutes, the diner had cleared, except for the 5 bikers now making their way inside. Margaret watched them through the large front window, noting details that others might miss. The oldest, a man in his 60s with a scar running from temple to jaw, moved with military precision despite his age. The youngest couldn't be more than 30, his face bearing the hollow look of recent grief. Between them were 3 others of varying ages, all carrying the invisible weight that came from miles on the road, and stories they didn't share with strangers. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. They stood for a moment, adjusting to the fluorescent lighting, scanning the now empty diner with the habitual wariness of men accustomed to hostility. Margaret straightened her uniform, grabbed 5 menus, and approached them with a smile that contained no fear. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Booth or counter?" The men exchanged glances, seemingly surprised by her greeting. "Booth," said the oldest, his voice gravelly from years of road dust and cigarettes. "Back corner, if that's all right." "Of course," Margaret replied, leading them to the largest booth. "Coffee to start." 5 nods. Margaret went to retrieve the pot, feeling Dale's eyes on her from the kitchen window. His expression said, "Everything be careful. Don't encourage them, get them in and out quickly." Margaret returned with the coffee and took out her order pad. "I'm Margaret. I'll be taking care of you today. Our special is meatloaf, but between us, the burgers are better." This drew a small smile from the youngest man, though it didn't reach his eyes. "5 burgers, then," said the oldest man. "All the fixings, fries for everyone." "And pie," added another, a bear of a man with a full beard. "Heard this place has good pie." "Best on Route 66, Margaret confirmed. "Apple and cherry today." "1 of each for the table," the leader decided. "And keep the coffee coming." As Margaret put in their order, Dale leaned close. "Watch yourself with that crowd," he muttered. "Those aren't regular customers." Margaret gave him a level look. "They seem like 5 hungry men to me, Dale." She returned to the table with coffee refills, noticing how the men spoke in low voices, occasionally falling silent when memories seemed too heavy to share. She caught fragments about someone named Mason, about a funeral in Nevada, about a brotherhood that stood together when the world stood apart. The youngest man's eyes were red-rimmed, his hands occasionally trembling around his coffee cup. The others positioned themselves protectively around him, creating a fortress of leather and loyalty. When Margaret brought their food, the conversation halted. The leader thanked her with unexpected courtesy. As she turned to leave, she noticed a tattoo on his forearm, USMC, United States Marine Corps. "My husband was Navy," she said before she could stop herself. "Served on the USS Abraham Lincoln." The man looked up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Good ship. When did he serve?" "Gulf War. He was a machinist's mate." The man nodded respectfully. "I was in Iraq. Different war, same sand." He extended his hand. "Ray Keller. Friends call me Scar, for obvious reasons." Margaret shook his hand, noting the calluses and the firm but respectful grip. "Margaret Wilson." "This is Bear," Ray continued, indicating the bearded giant. "Doc," nodding to a man in his 40s with intelligent eyes, and the name Sophia tattooed on his hand. "Wolf," a lean man with watchful eyes, and Tommy, the youngest. Tommy nodded but didn't speak, his gaze dropping to his untouched burger. "Tommy's dad was Mason," Ray explained quietly. "We just laid him to rest yesterday. Fallujah took him. Just took 20 years to finish the job." Margaret understood immediately. Another veteran lost to the invisible wounds of war, like so many others who came home different from the men who had left. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said to Tommy, meaning it. The young man looked up, surprise in his eyes at her sincerity. He managed a nod of acknowledgement before returning his attention to his plate. Margaret left them to their meal, checking back occasionally with coffee refills. She overheard snippets about Mason Jackson, a Marine who had saved his unit during an ambush, who had struggled with PTSD since returning home, who had finally surrendered to the battle he couldn't win. Tommy was his only son. They were taking him back to California, to the chapter house that had been Mason's second home. As they ate, Margaret found herself thinking about her own father. He'd been an outlaw rider in his youth before meeting her mother and settling down to raise a family. He'd taught Margaret that beneath the leather and intimidating exteriors, most riders lived by a code of honor stricter than what many respectable people followed. "Don't judge a man by his patches," he'd told her. "Judge him by how he treats those who can do nothing for him." 45 minutes later, the men had cleaned their plates and emptied the pie tins. Margaret brought their check, totaling $67.38, and set it on the table. "No rush," she assured them, moving to give them privacy. Ray Keller studied the check for a long moment, then looked up, his expression shifting. The other four men exchanged glances, tension suddenly radiating from their table. "Ma'am?" Ray called, his voice rougher than before. "I need to be straight with you about something." Margaret returned to the table, professional smile in place. "Is everything all right?" "No," Ray admitted, maintaining direct eye contact. "We got nothing." He opened his wallet, displaying its empty interior. The others did the same. Empty wallets, no credit cards, no cash. "We spent everything getting to Nevada for the funeral." Ray explained, his pride clearly wounded by the admission. "Hotel rooms, gas. Didn't think it through. Now we're heading home with empty tanks and empty pockets." He placed his wallet on the table, a gesture of honesty. "We shouldn't have ordered. That's on us. But we were hungry, and this place..." He glanced around the diner. "Mason would have liked it here." Margaret felt Dale's eyes on her from the kitchen. She knew the rule: no free meals. Every dollar comes from somewhere, and if it doesn't come from the customer, It comes from the server. $67. That was groceries for the week. That was half the electric bill. That was money she couldn't afford to lose. But Margaret also knew hunger. She knew what it meant to bury someone you loved and find yourself empty afterward. She knew what it was to be judged by appearance rather than character. Without a word, she picked up the check, tore it in half, then tore it again. The sound of paper ripping seemed to echo in the silent diner. "It's on the house," she said quietly. "You buried a brother." Nobody should have to worry about a meal at a time like that. For a moment, no one spoke. Ray stared at Margaret, as if trying to understand a language he'd never heard before. Tommy looked up, truly seeing her for the first time. "We can't accept that," Ray finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're working for a living. This isn't charity." "It's not charity," Margaret countered. "It's respect. For Mason. For what he sacrificed. My husband would have done the same." Ray studied her face, searching for ulterior motives, and finding none. The other men remained silent, understanding the weight of what was happening. After a long moment, Ray reached inside his vest and unpinned a patch. It was rectangular, with a symbol Margaret didn't recognize. He placed it carefully on the table. "In our world, we don't carry much cash, but we carry these," he explained. "Each patch means something, has value beyond money. This is collateral, a promise that the debt will be paid." One by one, the others did the same, each placing a patch on the table. 5 patches laid out like sacred objects, like promises that carried more weight than cash. "I don't understand," Margaret admitted. "The Brotherhood Code," Ray explained. "We pay our debts, always. This is our promise that we'll make this right." Margaret was about to protest when she felt Dale's presence behind her. His face was flushed with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Just thanking your waitress for excellent service," Ray replied smoothly, standing to his full height, which towered over Dale. "You've got good people working for you." Dale looked from the torn check to Margaret, his expression hardening. "Outside," he ordered her. "Now." Margaret followed him to the back of the diner, already knowing what was coming. "Are you out of your mind?" Dale hissed once they were alone. $67. That's coming straight out of your pay." "I know," Margaret acknowledged. "They're Hell's Angels, for Christ's sake. They're not some charity case." "They're veterans who just buried one of their own," Margaret corrected him. "And they were hungry." Dale ran a hand over his thinning hair. "This isn't a soup kitchen, Margaret. It's a business. My business." "I understand. Take it from my pay." Dale shook his head in disgust. "I will. Every penny." He stormed back into the diner. When Margaret returned, the 5 men were standing preparing to leave. They watched Dale retreat to his office, his anger evident in every step. "You'll lose money because of this," Ray stated, not a question. Margaret shrugged. "Some things matter more than money." Ray held her gaze for a long moment. "We don't forget kindness, Margaret Wilson, especially when it comes at a cost." The men filed out their boots, heavy on the linoleum floor. Tommy, the last to leave, paused at the door. He looked back at Margaret, placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of respect, and whispered, "Thank you. Again." Then they were gone, the rumble of motorcycles fading into the distance, leaving behind 5 patches and a silence that felt somehow significant. Margaret picked up the patches carefully, noticing their detailed craftsmanship. One read AFFA, Angels Forever, Forever Angels. Another displayed 81, H and A, the eighth and first letters of the alphabet. The death's head symbol appeared on several. These weren't just decorations. They were symbols of identity, of belonging. She slipped them into her apron pocket and began clearing the table. That evening, Margaret's paycheck was exactly $67.38 lighter. Dale had made sure of it, stapling a note that read, "Unauthorized comp, employee responsibility," to her pay stub. After taxes, she took home $219.42 for a 54-hour work week. Rent was due in 2 weeks, $450. The electric bill was already past due, and David needed a graphing calculator for his advanced math class, $80. Margaret folded the check, tucked it into her wallet, and tried not to think about how she would make the numbers work. The 5 patches sat on her dresser, strange talismans from a world she didn't belong to, but somehow understood. She didn't tell David about the bikers or the torn check. She made spaghetti with the last of the ground beef claimed she'd eaten at work, and listened to his excited plans for the engineering program he hoped to attend. That night, after David was asleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before her. She removed the hidden savings from the cookbook, counted it again, and calculated how far it would stretch. Not far enough. She returned the money to its hiding place, gathered the patches from her dresser, and studied them under the dim kitchen light. Strange symbols from men who lived by a different code, who had offered what they could when money failed. Margaret placed the patches back in her apron pocket. Tomorrow was another day. Another shift. Another chance to make the impossible math work out somehow. She didn't know that 60 miles away, Ray Keller was making a phone call that would change everything. She didn't know that the name Margaret Wilson was being spoken with reverence among men who rarely showed reverence for anything. She didn't know that in less than 48 hours, her small world would be surrounded by a brotherhood that never forgot a debt. Margaret Wilson fell asleep on her lumpy couch, unaware that wheels were already in motion. Unaware that for the first time in years, help was coming. Unaware that the kindness she had shown would return to her multiplied by hundreds. In the Brotherhood Code, debts were always paid. Always. And the debt to Margaret Wilson had just been called in. The next morning, whispers followed Margaret through the diner. Linda, the other waitress, kept shooting her looks that mixed disdain with curiosity. "I heard you just gave away $67 of food yesterday," Linda finally said during a lull. "To bikers." Margaret continued refilling salt shakers, not looking up. "They were veterans who'd just come from a funeral." Linda snorted. "Veterans are not, they're Hell's Angels. They probably have more money than all of us combined. Drug money, probably." "They didn't look rich to me," Margaret replied evenly. "They looked like men who'd lost someone important." "Well, some of us can't afford to be that noble," Linda retorted. "Some of us have bills to pay." Margaret finally looked up. "We all have bills to pay, Linda." The day dragged on. Dale assigned Margaret the worst tables, the ones known for poor tips. He scrutinized her every move, criticizing everything from her coffee pours to her table service. By the end of her shift, Margaret's feet throbbed, and her smile had become a rigid mask. The walk home felt longer than usual. A blister had formed on her right heel, where her shoe rubbed against skin. The desert heat, still intense even in late afternoon, pressed down on her like a physical weight. When she reached the trailer, David was already home from school, sitting at the kitchen table with a worried expression. "Mom, the power company called," he said as soon as she walked in. "They said our payment is late again." Margaret set down her purse, trying to hide her exhaustion. "Don't worry about it. I'll handle it. And Mrs. Peterson said some men were asking about you today." Bikers. Margaret froze. What men? What did they want? David shrugged. She didn't know. Said they just drove by slowly looking at our trailer. One of them took pictures. A chill ran down Margaret's spine despite the heat. Why would the bikers be interested in where she lived? Had she made a mistake tearing up that check? It's probably nothing, she assured David, though uncertainty gnawed at her. How was school? David brightened slightly. Mr. Callahan wants me to apply for a summer engineering program at Arizona State. It would look great on college applications. That sounds wonderful, Margaret said, genuinely pleased. When is it? Next month. It costs $480 for the 2-week program. Margaret's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. We'll figure it out, she promised, knowing the words were hollow. That night, after another meager dinner, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table with her calculator and bills. The numbers refused to cooperate. No matter how she moved them around, there wasn't enough. Not for rent, power, food, and certainly not for David's program. Tears of frustration burned behind her eyes. She had worked so hard for so long, yet always seemed to be falling further behind. From her apron pocket, Margaret withdrew the 5 patches. In the dim kitchen light, they seemed to almost glow with significance. A promise from men who lived by a different code. A debt they claimed they would pay. She traced the outline of one patch with her finger, wondering what it truly meant in their world. Then she carefully returned them to her pocket. Tomorrow would be better. It had to be. What Margaret didn't know was that 60 miles away, Ray Keller was speaking with Jim "Ghost" Harrington, a legendary figure in the Hells Angels hierarchy. A 65-year-old former Navy SEAL with a scar across his face from an IED in Iraq and a reputation for unwavering honor. She just tore up the check, Ray explained, voice filled with rare emotion. $67. Didn't hesitate. And that bastard owner took it straight from her pay. Ghost listened silently, his weathered face unreadable. Tommy hasn't spoken since Mason died, Ray continued. But he thanked her. Twice. She saw people ghost, not patches. She saw Mason, through us, respected what he gave for this country. Ghost nodded slowly, understanding exactly what Ray was saying. In their world, respect was currency. Loyalty was everything. And when someone outside their circle showed that respect, that loyalty without expecting anything in return, it created a debt that demanded repayment. Tell me about this woman, Ghost said, his voice a gravelly whisper from years of road dust and battlefield smoke. Ray described Margaret Wilson, her quiet dignity, her understanding eyes, the photo of her Navy husband she kept in her apron pocket, the son studying to be an engineer, the 3-legged dog she fed behind the diner. The Brotherhood Code is clear, Ghost finally said. We pay our debts, always. With those words, a chain reaction began. Ghost activated the Hells Angels communication network, a sophisticated system of calls, texts, and secure messages that connected chapters across the country. The message was simple. Margaret Wilson had shown respect when others showed fear. She had fed brothers when they had nothing. The Brotherhood would repay the debt. California chapters responded first, followed by Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Even a chapter from Colorado 12 hours away by highway. All with the same message: we ride for her. Meanwhile, Margaret's situation grew more desperate. The power company sent a final notice. The rent was coming due. David's engineering program deadline was approaching, and her ancient Chevy still sat useless in the trailer park lot, needing a transmission she couldn't afford. On Friday night, Margaret counted her savings once more. $1,243. Everything she had managed to scrape together over 3 years of double shifts and skipped meals. If she used it all, she could pay the overdue power bill, make the rent, and still have enough for David's program. But there would be nothing left. No safety net, no emergency fund, nothing for the inevitable next crisis. The choice tore at her: David's future or their security. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. The money went back into the cookbook set aside for David's program. Margaret would figure out the rest somehow. She always did. What she didn't know was that Ray Keller had been watching her trailer, had seen her walk those 3 miles to and from work every day, had noticed the increasingly desperate collection notices in her mailbox, had observed the ancient Chevy sitting useless in the lot. And what Margaret definitely didn't know was that Ghost had mobilized over 800 Hells Angels members from 12 states. Operation Payback was in motion. The debt would be paid. The Brotherhood Code would be fulfilled. Saturday morning arrived cold and dark. Margaret's alarm went off at 4:30, as it did every day. She had the early shift needed to be at the diner by 5:30 to prepare for the breakfast rush. But something was wrong. A sound in the distance growing louder. A rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the windows. A roar that seemed to encircle the entire trailer park. Margaret got up, wrapping her robe tightly around her. Through the window she saw headlights, dozens, then hundreds of them, forming a circle around the park. The neighbor's porch light flicked on. Mrs. Peterson appeared in her doorway, phone in hand, frantically dialing. "Mom!" David called from the bedroom, voice thick with sleep and fear. "Stay inside," Margaret ordered. "Lock the door behind me." Heart pounding, she stepped onto the small porch of her trailer. The desert dawn cast long shadows across the sandy ground, illuminating a sight that didn't seem possible. Motorcycles. Hundreds of them. Harleys arranged in a perfect circle around the entire trailer park. Headlights, blazing engines, rumbling in unified power. Men in leather vests stood beside their bikes, patches catching the first rays of sunlight. Death's heads. EFA 81. The symbols of a brotherhood that had surrounded her home. From the mass of leather and chrome, a single figure emerged. Ray Keller, the scarred Marine, walked toward her with deliberate steps, carrying a worn leather bag in his massive hands. Behind him came others, Ghost, a legend made flesh. Bear, Doc, Wolf, and Tommy. The 5 from the diner, now backed by an army of brothers. Margaret stood frozen, uncertain whether to run or stand her ground. The rumble of 800 engines filled the desert morning, then suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Ray stopped 10 feet from her porch, his scarred face solemn. "Margaret Wilson," he said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. "My name is Ray Keller. 3 days ago you fed me and my brothers when we had nothing. You showed respect when others showed fear. You gave dignity to men in mourning." He paused, emotion tightening his features. "The Brotherhood doesn't forget." Ray Keller stood before Margaret, the leather bag heavy in his hands, his scarred face solemn in the early morning light. The circle of Hell's Angels remained perfectly still, their engines silent, creating a wall of chrome and leather around the trailer park. "The Brotherhood doesn't forget," Ray said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. Margaret trembled slightly, her thin robe offering little protection against the desert chill or the intensity of the moment. Behind her, she could sense David watching through the window, afraid for his mother. "3 days ago," Ray continued, "you showed us respect when others showed fear. You gave us dignity when we had nothing to offer in return." He looked down at the leather bag, then extended it toward Margaret. "This is how we repay our debts." Margaret hesitated, unsure what to expect. Her eyes searched Ray's face for any sign of threat, but found only earnestness. With shaking hands, she accepted the bag, surprised by its weight. "Open it," Ray urged gently. Margaret unzipped the bag and peered inside. Her knees nearly buckled. Cash. Stacks of it bound with rubber bands. 20s, 50s, hundreds. More money than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. $15,000, Ray said quietly, collected from chapters in 12 states gathered in 48 hours. That's what your kindness is worth to us. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. $15,000. That was 7 months of rent. That was a new transmission, and then some. That was David's college fund. "I can't accept this," she finally whispered. "You can, and you will," came a new voice. An older man moved through the crowd, taller than Ray, with a face that bore the evidence of hard years. A scar ran across his right cheek, deep and jagged. His eyes, however, held a clarity that commanded attention. This is Ghost," Ray explained. "Road captain. Legend." Ghost approached Margaret slowly, his bearing that of a man accustomed to respect. "The code is clear," he said, his voice raspy, yet powerful. "A debt must be paid. You honored our brothers when they were broken. Now we honor you." Behind Ghost, other bikers began to step forward, each carrying something. One man held a toolbox. Another carried what looked like electrical equipment. A woman with gray hair braided down her back approached with a stack of envelopes. "The money is just the beginning," Ray explained. "We've got mechanics for your car, electricians for your trailer, whatever needs fixing. You don't pay. You don't owe. You already paid when you honored our dead and fed our living." Margaret clutched the bag to her chest, tears now streaming freely down her face. "I just tore up a check," she said, her voice breaking. "It was nothing." Ghost shook his head. "In a world where most look away, you looked at us and saw human beings. That's not nothing. That's everything." The first rays of the Arizona sun crested the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the gathering. Neighbors had begun to emerge from their trailers, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and fascination. Mrs. Peterson still clutched her phone, but her finger no longer hovered over the dial. Mr. Jenkins, a retired postal worker, stood on his small porch in his bathrobe, mouth agape. Children peered from windows, eyes wide at the sea of motorcycles. "Mom!" David called from the doorway, his voice uncertain. Margaret turned to see her son standing there, tall and lanky, in his sleep clothes, hair mussed, eyes darting nervously between his mother and the assembled bikers. "It's okay, David," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "These are friends." Ghost regarded the young man with interest. "Your son?" Margaret nodded. "David. He's 16. Wants to be an engineer." Ghost exchanged glances with Ray, a silent communication passing between them. Then Ghost reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper. He handed it to Margaret. "For the engineer," he said simply. Margaret unfolded the paper. It was a certificate for a scholarship. $10,000 for David's education, administered through something called the Mason Jackson Memorial Fund. Mason was Tommy's father, Ray explained softly. Before the PTSD took him, he helped set up scholarship funds for kids of veterans who couldn't afford college. Tommy wanted your son to be included. David had moved closer, standing protectively beside his mother. Margaret handed him the certificate, watching as confusion gave way to comprehension on his young face. "I don't understand," David said, looking between the paper and the gathering of bikers. Why would you do this for us? Ray placed a hand on David's shoulder. Because your mother saw past our patches to the men beneath. She honored our brother Mason through us, without even knowing his name. In our world, that creates a debt that must be paid. The sun continued to rise, casting golden light across the scene. A transformation was taking place. What had begun as a frightening invasion was becoming something else entirely. The line of bikers that had seemed so threatening now formed a protective circle. The rumble that had shaken the trailer park was replaced by the sounds of work beginning. A group of men approached Margaret's old Chevy, popping the hood and assessing the transmission. Others moved toward the trailer, tools in hand, ready to fix the leaky roof and faulty wiring. A makeshift kitchen was being set up in an empty lot, with women unpacking coolers filled with food. "We're staying until the job is done," Ghost announced. "Your car fixed, your home repaired, your debts settled." Margaret stood in stunned silence, the leather bag still clutched in her hands, watching as strangers in leather vests and patches swarmed over her small world with purpose and determination. David beside her, equally speechless. "This can't be real," she whispered. Ray smiled, the scar on his face softening. "It's real, Margaret Wilson. The Brotherhood has spoken." The morning progressed in a blur of activity. Margaret and David were guided to a folding table where breakfast had been laid out. Eggs, bacon, pancakes, orange juice. More food than they'd had in the house in months. They ate in bewildered silence, while all around them the Hells Angels worked. The mechanics diagnosed the transmission problem within an hour. "Complete rebuild needed," announced a burly man with a gray beard who introduced himself as Diesel. "We brought the parts. Should be running by nightfall." Electricians examined the trailer's wiring and pronounced it a fire hazard. "Whoever did this wiring should be shot," declared a lean man called Sparky. "We'll have it rewired properly by sunset." A roofing crew was already on top of the trailer, replacing damaged shingles and ceiling leaks that Margaret had been catching in buckets for years. Inside, plumbers fixed the chronically dripping faucet and the toilet that had to be jiggled just so to stop running. Carpenters repaired broken cabinets and the step that had been threatening to collapse. Margaret sat in a lawn chair watching it all happen with a sense of unreality. David beside her, equally stunned. "Who are these people, Mom?" he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. "They're the Hells Angels, David. They're—" She paused, searching for words. "They're not what most people think they are." The woman with the gray braid approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Margaret and one to David. "I'm Ruth," she said, her face weathered but kind. "Been riding with the Angels for 20 years. My old man was a founding member of the Arizona chapter before he passed." "Thank you for the coffee," Margaret said automatically, "and for all of this. I still don't understand why." Ruth sat in a chair beside them. "Let me tell you something about the Brotherhood. We live by a code that most folks don't get. Loyalty, honor, respect. When you showed respect to our brothers in their darkest moment, you became family. And we take care of family." As Ruth spoke, the neighbors had begun to venture closer, curiosity overcoming fear. Mrs. Peterson approached cautiously, still in her nightgown and slippers. "Margaret," she called, "are you all right? Should I still call the police?" Before Margaret could answer, Ghost appeared. He nodded respectfully to Mrs. Peterson. "Ma'am, we're just here to help a friend. No need for authorities." Mrs. Peterson looked skeptical, but something in Ghost's calm assurance seemed to reach her. "Well," she said finally, "if Margaret says it's okay—" "It's okay, Edith," Margaret confirmed. "These people are helping us. More neighbors gathered, watching the activity with growing interest. The children initially kept inside were now being allowed out to look at the motorcycles. A biker with full sleeve tattoos was showing a group of wide-eyed kids how the throttle worked on his Harley. By mid-morning, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a terrifying invasion had transformed into something like a community event. Neighbors brought out folding chairs. Someone turned on a radio. The smell of barbecue began to fill the air as the angels set up grills for lunch. Margaret sat in her chair watching it all with a sense of wonder. Beside her, the leather bag of money remained untouched, its presence both miraculous and slightly frightening. $15,000. The sum represented freedom from immediate worry, but its sudden appearance in her life felt almost unreal. Ray approached, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Transmission's coming along," he reported. "Diesel says another few hours. He's also checking the brakes and changing the oil. That car's going to run better than it has in years." Margaret nodded, still overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you. All of you." Ray crouched down to be at eye level with her. "You already did. The day you tore up that check." She shook her head. "That was nothing compared to this." "That's where you're wrong," Ray said quietly. "What you did that day, it meant everything. Especially to Tommy." Ray glanced over to where the youngest of the original 5 bikers stood helping with the roof repair. Tommy hadn't spoken since we buried his father. Mason was his world. When PTSD finally took Mason from us, it was like Tommy died too, until you showed him that kindness still exists in this world. Margaret followed Ray's gaze to the young man on her roof. "What happened to his father?" Ray's expression darkened. "Mason served 3 tours in Iraq. Fallujah, Ramadi. The worst of it. Came home with medals and nightmares. VA didn't do enough. Nobody did. He tried, God knows he tried, but the demons were too strong. 2 weeks ago, he lost the fight." Margaret's hand went to her heart. "I'm so sorry." 22 veterans a day, Margaret," Ray said, his voice hollow. "That's how many we lose to suicide. Mason was one of the strongest men I've ever known, and even he couldn't outrun the darkness." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of those words hanging between them. Then Ray stood. "But today isn't about mourning. It's about honoring. And that's what we're doing for you, because you honored him without even knowing it." As Ray walked away, Margaret felt David's hand on her shoulder. Her son had been listening to their conversation, his young face serious with understanding beyond his years. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I get it now." Margaret covered his hand with hers. "Get what, honey? What Dad always used to say. About doing the right thing, even when it's hard. About how it comes back to you somehow." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. Bill had indeed said that so many times. The good you do returns to you, maybe not how you expect, but it always returns, had been his mantra. She'd begun to doubt those words in the hard years since his death. Until now. Around noon, a local news van pulled up at the edge of the trailer park. A reporter with perfectly coiffed hair and a cameraman emerged, drawn by calls from curious neighbors about the unusual gathering. Ghost intercepted them before they could approach Margaret. A brief conversation ensued, with Ghost gesturing firmly toward Margaret's trailer and the reporter nodding in understanding. After a few minutes, the reporter approached Ghost at her side. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Stephanie Chen from Channel 12 News. Would you mind if we asked you a few questions about what's happening here today?" Margaret looked to Ghost, who nodded slightly. "It's your call," he said. "But this is a story worth telling." Margaret hesitated, then agreed. The camera was set up, and soon she found herself explaining the events that had led to this extraordinary day. She told about the 5 bikers at the diner, about tearing up the check, about waking to find hundreds of Hell's Angels surrounding her home. "So, this is all because you gave 5 hungry men a free meal?" Stephanie asked her expression, suggesting she wasn't entirely convinced. "It wasn't about the meal," Ghost interjected. "It was about the respect. In a world that fears us, judges us, Margaret Wilson saw beyond our patches to the men beneath. She honored our fallen brother through her kindness to those who mourned him. The brotherhood repays its debts. Always." The camera turned to capture the scene around them. Bikers repairing a car, fixing a roof, rewiring a trailer. Neighbors sharing food with men in leather vests. Children sitting on parked motorcycles, faces alight with excitement. "This is quite a story," Stephanie admitted. "Mind if we get some more footage?" "As long as you tell it true," Ghost replied. "This isn't about making us look good or bad. It's about honor, about respect, about the code we live by." As the news crew moved through the gathering, Margaret found herself approached by Tommy, the youngest of the original 5 bikers. He stood awkwardly before her, hands in his pockets, eyes still carrying the grief she'd noticed that first day. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice soft, "I wanted to thank you personally. What you did at the diner, it was the first kindness I'd felt since my dad died." Margaret reached out and took his hand. "I'm so sorry about your father, Tommy. He must have been a remarkable man." Tommy nodded, swallowing hard. "He was. The best. Even when the PTSD was bad, he never stopped trying to be a good dad. He'd have liked you. You remind me of him, actually. The way you put others first." Tommy reached into his vest and pulled out a small metal object. A set of dog tags. These were his, from his first tour. "I want you to have them." Margaret shook her head. "I couldn't possibly take something so personal." "Please," Tommy insisted. "Dad always said when someone shows you true respect, you honor them in return. These tags represent the best part of him, the part that served others, like you do." With trembling hands, Margaret accepted the dog tags. The metal was warm from being carried close to Tommy's heart. She read the stamped information, Jackson Mason J. USMC, OPOS. The weight of them in her palm felt significant, sacred. "I'll treasure them," she promised. Tommy nodded, then surprised her by leaning down to hug her tightly. "Thank you for showing me that good people still exist," he whispered. As Tommy walked away, Margaret looked down at the dog tags in her hand, then around at the extraordinary scene unfolding in her modest trailer park. Hundreds of Hell's Angels working together to transform her life in a single day. Neighbors who had feared them now sharing food and conversation. A news crew capturing it all. And at the center of it, a simple act of kindness that had somehow set this all in motion. A torn check. A meal freely given. Respect shown when it wasn't expected. The day continued with a rhythm all its own. By mid-afternoon, Diesel announced that the transmission rebuild was complete. "Start her up," he called to Ray, who slid behind the wheel of Margaret's ancient Chevy. The engine turned over on the first try, purring with a smoothness Margaret hadn't heard in years. A cheer went up from the gathered crowd. "That's not all," Diesel added proudly. "New brakes, new belts, oil change, fluid flush. This old girl's got another 100,000 miles in her easy." Margaret approached the car in wonder, running her hand along the newly washed and waxed exterior. The rusty spots had been treated and painted. The cracked windshield had been replaced. Even the interior had been detailed, the torn upholstery repaired with expert stitching. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "Say you will accept it," Ray replied. "Say you understand what this means to us." Margaret nodded, tears threatening again. I accept, and I'm beginning to understand. Inside her trailer, the transformation was equally dramatic. New wiring throughout the ancient plumbing, repaired or replaced walls, patched and painted. The roof no longer leaked. The broken furniture had been fixed or replaced. Even the ancient refrigerator had been replaced with a newer model already stocked with food. David's room had received special attention. New shelves for his books, a proper desk for his studies. And in the center of it all, a state-of-the-art laptop computer with engineering software already installed. For the future engineer, Ghost explained when David discovered it, every builder needs the right tools. The day began to wane, the desert sun casting long shadows across the trailer park. The work was nearly complete. Margaret's car restored, her home repaired, her immediate financial worries erased by the gift of $15,000 and a $10,000 scholarship for David. As twilight approached, Ghost called everyone together. The hundreds of Hell's Angels formed a circle around Margaret and David, with the neighbors gathered close by. The news crew remained, cameras rolling. "Brothers and sisters," Ghost began, his raspy voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "today we've fulfilled our obligation under the code. A debt has been paid." He turned to Margaret. "But something else has happened here. Something unexpected." He gestured to the neighbors now mingling comfortably with the bikers. "Bridges have been built. Understanding has grown. People who saw only our patches this morning now see the men and women beneath them." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. "Margaret Wilson," Ghost continued, "you did more than feed 5 hungry brothers. You reminded us why the code exists in the first place, not just to govern us, but to connect us to what matters, to humanity, to decency, to respect." He extended his hand to Margaret. "On behalf of the Brotherhood, I thank you, not just for what you did for our brothers, but for what you've reminded us to be." Margaret took his hand, her own seeming small in his weathered grip. "I should be thanking you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've changed our lives today." "And you changed ours 3 days ago," Ghost replied simply. As the sun set, preparations began for departure. The tools were packed away. The temporary kitchen dismantled. Leather vests were zipped up against the cooling desert air. Helmets retrieved from motorcycle seats. One by one, the bikers approached Margaret and David to say goodbye. Handshakes, hugs, promises to check in, phone numbers exchanged. What had begun as strangers was ending as something like family. Ruth, the woman with the gray braid, embraced Margaret warmly. "This isn't the end," she promised. "The local chapter will check on you, and if you ever need anything day or night, you call. You're family now." Diesel gave David a card with his number. "That car needs regular maintenance. You bring it to my shop in Phoenix, no charge, ever." Even Mrs. Peterson had been won over. She pressed a pie into Ghost's hands before he left. "For the road," she insisted. "My mother's recipe." Ghost accepted it with solemn courtesy. "A gift freely given is a sacred thing," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Thank you, ma'am." As the bikers prepared to mount up, a black SUV pulled into the trailer park. It moved slowly through the gathering, coming to a stop near Margaret's trailer. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Average height, thinning hair, pressed shirt, and slacks. Dale Fisher, Margaret's boss, owner of the Last Mile Diner. A ripple of tension moved through the crowd. The bikers who recognized him from the diner exchanged glances. Ray moved to stand protectively near Margaret. Ghost watched Dale with narrowed eyes. Dale approached hesitantly, clearly intimidated by the sea of leather-clad figures surrounding Margaret's trailer. He clutched a small envelope in his hand. "Margaret," He called, his voice uncertain. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Margaret stepped forward, Ray at her side. "Hello, Dale." Dale's eyes darted nervously around the gathering, taking in the repaired trailer, the restored car, the hundreds of Hell's Angels watching him with cool assessment. "I saw the news," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the departing news van. "They're saying all this is because you tore up that check at the diner." "It is," Margaret confirmed. Dale swallowed hard. "I didn't understand. I thought you were just being foolish. I didn't know about—" He gestured again at the assembled bikers. "All this." He thrust the envelope toward Margaret. "Here, it's $67.38. What I took from your pay. I was wrong." Margaret looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "Keep it, Dale. Consider it my contribution to what happened here today." Dale looked confused. "But I treated you unfairly." "Yes, you did," Margaret agreed. "But holding on to that won't make my life better. Letting it go might make yours better, though." Ghost stepped forward, his imposing presence causing Dale to take an involuntary step back. "You employ a woman of rare quality," Ghost said, his raspy voice carrying an edge of steel. "I hope you appreciate that moving forward." Dale nodded rapidly. "Yes, of course." He looked back at Margaret. "Your job is still there if you want it. In fact, I'd like to offer you a raise and a promotion to shift manager." Margaret considered this. The money from the Hell's Angels would ease her immediate burdens, but she would still need employment. And despite Dale's flaws, the Last Mile Diner had been her workplace for 17 years. "I'll be there for my regular shift tomorrow," she said finally. Dale seemed relieved. "Good, that's good." He glanced around at the bikers again, then back to Margaret. "I'll see you tomorrow then." As Dale retreated to his SUV, Ray gave Margaret a questioning look. "You're going back to work for that guy, after how he treated you?" Margaret nodded. "The diner's been part of my life for a long time, and everyone deserves a chance to do better, don't they?" Ray considered this, then nodded slowly. "The wisdom of Margaret Wilson," he said with a small smile, "keeps surprising me." As Dale's SUV disappeared from view, Ghost raised his hand. A signal. Across the trailer park, bikers mounted their motorcycles. Engines roared to life in a synchronized symphony of power. Ghost approached Margaret one last time. "The debt is paid," he said formally, "but the bond remains. You're part of our extended family now, Margaret Wilson. Never forget that." Margaret looked up at this formidable man who had orchestrated such an extraordinary day. "I won't forget," she promised. "Not any of it." Ghost nodded, satisfied. He turned to David. "Take care of your mother, future engineer. Build those bridges strong." David stood a little straighter. "I will, sir." Ghost mounted his motorcycle, a massive black Harley with custom details that spoke of thousands of miles on the road. He raised his hand once more, and the formation began to move. Like a great leather beast awakening, the circle of Hell's Angels flowed into a line, engines rumbling as they departed the trailer park one by one. Ray was among the last to leave. He paused beside Margaret. "Tommy's going to be okay," he said, "thanks to you. You gave him back his voice when grief had stolen it. That's worth more than all the money and repairs combined." Margaret touched the dog tags that hung around her neck, now Mason Jackson's legacy. His father would be proud of him. "Yes," Ray agreed, "and of you." He started his motorcycle, the engine's roar filling the space between them. "See you around, Margaret Wilson." "Ride safe, Ray Keller," Margaret replied. And then, They were gone, the thunder of engines fading into the distance, leaving behind a transformed trailer park and a transformed life. Neighbors slowly dispersed to their homes, still discussing the extraordinary events of the day. The sun had fully set. Now the desert night cool and clear, stars emerging in the vast Arizona sky. Margaret and David stood together outside their repaired trailer, watching until the last taillight disappeared on the horizon. "Mom," David said finally, "do you think Dad knows about today?" Margaret put her arm around her son's shoulders, feeling the strength in him that reminded her so much of Bill. "I think he does," she said softly. "I think maybe he's been watching over us all along." And they went inside their home, so familiar, yet so changed, to begin this new chapter of their lives. The leather bag of money sat on the kitchen table, the scholarship certificate beside it. Mason's dog tags hung around Margaret's neck, tangible reminders of an extraordinary day when the Brotherhood had paid its debt. But the most profound change wasn't visible. It was the restoration of something Margaret had been in danger of losing through years of struggle and hardship. Something more valuable than money or material repairs. Hope. In the morning, Margaret would return to the Last Mile Diner. She would pour coffee and serve pie and listen to Mr. Henderson tell his USO story for the 100th time. But she would do it with the knowledge that she was not alone in the world, that her small acts of kindness mattered, that respect given freely could return 1,000-fold. And in the weeks and months to come, Margaret would discover that the events of this day had set other wheels in motion. The news story about the Hells Angels and the Waitress would go viral, touching hearts across the country. A movement called Pay It Forward would take root at the Last Mile Diner, with customers prepaying meals for those who couldn't afford them. Dale Fisher would transform from a bitter, penny-pinching boss into a cautious supporter of this new approach, especially when business increased dramatically as people came from miles around to visit the diner made famous by Margaret and the Hells Angels. David would excel in school, his path to engineering school now clear of financial obstacles. He would volunteer at the local VA hospital inspired by Mason Jackson's story and determined to ensure no veteran felt forgotten, and the Hells Angels. They would return periodically to check on Margaret and David. Ray, Ghost, Tommy Bear, Doc, and Wolf would become regular visitors to the Last Mile Diner. A special table would be reserved for them, marked with a small plaque reading simply, "Reserved for Respect." The Brotherhood had paid its debt, but in doing so, it had created something that would continue long after this day. A reminder that beneath the surface of judgments and assumptions, beneath the patches and the uniforms and the labels society applies, there exists the potential for connection, for understanding, for respect. All it takes is one person willing to tear up a check and say, "It's on the house." One person willing to see beyond appearances to the humanity beneath. One person like Margaret Wilson. As the desert night deepened around the trailer park, as Margaret and David settled into their renewed home, as the last echoes of motorcycle engines faded on the horizon, the story was already spreading, moving outward like ripples from a stone cast into still water, touching lives far beyond this small corner of Arizona. The Brotherhood had spoken. The code had been fulfilled. The debt had been paid. But the story was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the day 800 Hells Angels surrounded Margaret Wilson's trailer. Arizona summer had given way to autumn, bringing merciful relief from the desert heat. The mountains visible from Route 66 now wore a dusting of snow on their highest peaks, catching the morning sunlight, as Margaret drove to work in her perfectly running Chevy. The Last Mile Diner had changed. Not its physical appearance, the chrome fixtures still gleamed, The vinyl booths remained faded turquoise. The jukebox still only played songs from before 1975. But something fundamental had shifted within its walls, like a current of electricity running through circuits long dormant. Business was booming. The viral news story about the Waitress and the Hells Angels had put the Last Mile Diner on the map. Tourists detoured from their Route 66 journeys specifically to eat where it happened. Locals who had previously bypassed the aging establishment now made it their regular breakfast spot. Margaret pulled into the parking lot at 5:15 a.m., her usual time, but no longer had to park in the farthest corner to save the closer spots for paying customers. Those days were gone. Now Dale reserved a special spot for her near the entrance marked with a small hand-painted sign reading, "Margaret's Place." She entered through the back door, the bell jingling softly in the pre-dawn quiet. Dale was already in the kitchen prepping for the breakfast rush. "Morning, Margaret," he called, his tone respectful. Gone was the bitter taskmaster of 6 months ago. In his place stood a man humbled by public scrutiny and transformed by unexpected success. "Morning, Dale," Margaret replied, hanging her coat on the rack. "Looks like another busy day ahead." Dale nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. "Tour bus coming through at 10. 40 seniors from Minnesota all wanting to sit at the table." The table had become something of a legend. The corner booth where Ray, Tommy, and the others had sat that fateful day was now marked with a brass plaque reading simply, "Reserved for respect." Customers requested it specifically, considering it good luck to dine where the story began. Margaret smiled as she tied on her apron. From the pocket she withdrew the 5 patches that had started it all. She'd had them framed in a shadow box that now hung prominently on the diner wall alongside newspaper clippings about that extraordinary day and photos of the Brotherhood gathered around her trailer. Below the display, a glass jar sat on the counter already half filled with cash, even though the diner hadn't opened yet. "Pay it forward" was written on a card attached to the jar. The concept had been Dale's idea, surprisingly. Anyone could contribute, and the money went toward meals for those who couldn't afford to pay. "You were right," Dale had admitted to Margaret one day, several weeks after the Hells Angels' visit. "Kindness does come back to you, just not always how you expect." The diner's transformation extended beyond business success. It had become a gathering place for different worlds. Businessmen in suits sat beside mechanics in work clothes. College students shared tables with retirees. And once a week, like clockwork, members of the local Hells Angels chapter came for breakfast, their motorcycles lined up outside like sentinels. Today was such a day. Margaret glanced at the clock as she prepared the coffee urns. They would arrive at 7:30 as they always did on Thursdays. Ray and Tommy came most often, but sometimes Ghost would appear, his presence commanding, even in the mundane setting of a roadside diner. The bell above the door jingled as Linda entered 15 minutes early for her shift. Another change. Once sullen and resentful, Linda had been swept up in the diner's revival, her attitude softening as she witnessed firsthand the power of Margaret's simple act of kindness. "Morning," Linda called cheerfully. "David off to school already?" Margaret nodded. "Science fair project. He's meeting his team at the lab early." David had blossomed in these past 6 months. The scholarship from the Mason Jackson Memorial Fund had secured his place in a prestigious engineering program after graduation. His grades, always good, had become exceptional. But more importantly, he had found purpose. Inspired by Mason's story, he had started a support group for children of veterans suffering from PTSD, meeting weekly at the local community center. Mason's dog tags still hung around Margaret's neck, a constant reminder of how a simple act of respect had changed everything. The morning proceeded with the familiar rhythm of a successful restaurant. Regular customers arrived at their usual times, Coffee was poured, orders were taken. The smell of bacon and pancakes filled the air. Margaret moved through it all with practiced ease, her smile genuine as she greeted people by name. At precisely 7:30, the distinctive rumble of Harley-Davidson engines announced the arrival of the Thursday regulars. Margaret glanced out the window to see 5 motorcycles pull into the parking lot. Ray, Tommy, Bear, and Wolf, 4 of the original 5 from that day. And with them, Ghost making a rare appearance. Something was different today. The men wore formal leather vests adorned with special patches Margaret had come to recognize as markers of ceremonial occasions. They entered the diner with solemn purpose, nodding to Margaret, but proceeding directly to their reserved booth without the usual banter. Margaret approached with the coffee pot. "Morning, gentlemen. The usual." Ray looked up, his scarred face serious. "Just coffee for now, Margaret. We've got something important to discuss with you." Margaret poured 5 cups, noting the grave expressions around the table. "Everything all right?" Ghost cleared his throat. "6 months ago today," he said, his raspy voice carrying in the suddenly quiet diner. "The Brotherhood paid a debt to you, Margaret Wilson." Other customers had fallen silent, sensing something significant was unfolding. Even Dale emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "That debt has been repaid tenfold," Ghost continued. "Not by us, but by you. What you've created here." He gestured to the pay-it-forward jar, the packed diner, the atmosphere of community, goes beyond what any of us expected. Ray reached into his vest and withdrew an envelope. "The Mason Jackson Memorial Fund has raised over $100,000 since the story broke. Kids of veterans who couldn't afford college now have a shot, thanks to what started here." Tommy, who had grown more confident in the past 6 months, spoke up. "My father would have been proud to see his name associated with something so positive. The darkness that took him is being countered by light." Margaret felt tears forming. She had heard about the fund's growth but hadn't realized the full extent of its impact. Ghost stood commanding attention without effort. "The Brotherhood has made a decision, Margaret Wilson. One we've never made before." The diner was completely silent now. Even the cook had stopped working to listen. From his vest, Ghost withdrew a small object. A patch. But not just any patch. This one was unique, custom-made. It showed the Hells Angels' Death's Head logo, but with a subtle difference. Above it, in elegant script, was a single word: respect. "This is the first honorary member patch ever created by the Hells Angels," Ghost explained. "It carries no obligations, no duties. It simply marks the wearer as someone who has earned our highest respect. Someone who lives by the code without ever having taken the oath." He held the patch out to Margaret. "The Brotherhood has voted. Unanimously." Margaret stared at the patch, understanding the profound significance of what was being offered. In their world, patches weren't merely decorations. They were identity, status, belonging. "I'm deeply honored," she said softly, accepting the patch with trembling hands. "But I don't know if I can accept something so significant." "You've already earned it," Ray said firmly, "by living the values we claim to uphold. Loyalty, respect, honor. Not just talking about them, but embodying them every day." Ghost nodded in agreement. "The patch is yours, whether you choose to display it or not. Your actions have already made you part of our extended family." Margaret looked down at the patch, then around at the diner full of people watching this unexpected ceremony. Regular customers, tourists, truck drivers, all witnesses to this unlikely bond between a waitress and an outlaw motorcycle club. "Thank you," she said simply, holding the patch against her heart. "I'll treasure it always." A cheer erupted from the customers, many of whom had become familiar with the story that had transformed the Last Mile diner. Applause filled the air as Margaret embraced each of the bikers in turn, ending with Tommy, who whispered, "My dad would have loved you," in her ear. Dale stepped forward, clearly moved by what he had witnessed. "In honor of this occasion," he announced, "breakfast is on the house for everyone today." This drew another round of applause. Margaret gave Dale a surprised look, and he shrugged with a small smile. "I'm learning," he said quietly. As the celebration continued, the door opened again. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the morning sun, hesitating at the threshold. The conversations quieted as people turned to look. It was Carl "Doc" Stevens, the fifth member of the original group, the one with Sophia's name tattooed on his hand. He hadn't been seen at the diner in months. Ray stood immediately. "Doc!" he called, genuine surprise in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you today." Doc moved into the diner slowly, his face thinner than Margaret remembered, his eyes carrying the hollow look of profound grief. "I heard about the ceremony," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Didn't want to miss it." Ghost made room in the booth, and Doc slid in beside him, nodding to Margaret with respect. "Congratulations," he said softly. "It's well-deserved." Margaret studied him with concern. Of the 5 original bikers, Doc had seemed the most emotionally controlled, but something had changed. The grief she glimpsed now was raw, almost palpable. "How have you been, Doc?" she asked gently, pouring him coffee. He stared into the cup, his fingers tracing the name tattooed on his hand. "Surviving," he answered truthfully. "Some days better than others." Ray exchanged glances with Ghost. Something unspoken passed between them. "Doc lost Sophia 2 months before Mason died," Ray explained quietly to Margaret. "Cancer. She was 39. Understanding dawned. The hollowness in Doc's eyes wasn't just grief. It was the same darkness that had claimed Mason Jackson. The silent battle that 22 veterans lost every day. Margaret made a decision in that moment. She slid into the booth beside Doc, her new honorary patch still in her hand. "Tell me about Sophia," she said. Doc looked up surprised. The diner had returned to its normal buzz of conversation, giving them a measure of privacy. "What, Sophia?" Margaret repeated gently. "Tell me about her. What was she like?" For a moment Doc seemed unable to speak. Then slowly words began to form. "She was a nurse, pediatric oncology, spent her days helping kids with the same disease that eventually took her. Never lost her smile, even at the end." As Doc spoke, something changed in his expression. The hollowness receded slightly, replaced by bittersweet memory. He told Margaret how he and Sophia had met at a VA hospital, where he was receiving treatment for PTSD after his second tour in Iraq. How she had seen past his gruff exterior to the wounded soul beneath. How they had built a life together despite his demons, her unwavering support keeping him anchored when the nightmares came. "She made me promise to keep living," Doc said, finally, his voice breaking. "Said my life was part of her legacy. I'm trying. Some days, I don't know how." Margaret listened without interruption, offering the gift of her complete attention. When Doc finished speaking, she placed her hand over his, covering Sophia's name with gentle warmth. "Now I know her too," Margaret said softly, "and as long as we remember her, she's never truly gone." Doc's eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. He nodded once, a gesture of profound gratitude. The others at the table sat in respectful silence, honoring both Sophia's memory and the healing moment they had witnessed. Ghost cleared his throat. "The ceremony isn't quite complete," he said, returning their attention to the honorary patch Margaret still held. There's a tradition when a patch is presented. He nodded to Ray, who produced a small sewing kit from his vest pocket. The recipient must attach the patch themselves, Ghost explained, symbolizing that they claim the honor of their own free will. Margaret considered for a moment, then removed her apron. With steady hands and Ray's guidance, she began to sew the honorary patch onto the upper left side of the apron just above her heart. As she worked, the significance of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. A waitress in a roadside diner accepting formal recognition from one of the world's most notorious motorcycle clubs. When the final stitch was complete, Margaret put the apron back on. The patch stood out against the pink fabric, distinct and unmistakable. A symbol of an unexpected bond, a bridge built between worlds that rarely intersected. "It's official," Ghost declared, his raspy voice carrying throughout the diner. "Margaret Wilson is now an honorary member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, recognized for embodying the highest principles of the Brotherhood Code." Applause erupted again, our customers standing to honor the moment. Even those who had just walked in, not knowing what was happening, were caught up in the emotional atmosphere. As Margaret returned to her duties, the patch now prominently displayed on her apron, she felt a profound sense of belonging. Not just to the brotherhood that had honored her, but to something larger. A community that had formed around a single act of kindness, growing into a movement that continued to spread. The rest of the morning passed in a celebratory mood. The bikers ordered their usual breakfast, joined by Doc, who ate little but seemed more present than when he had arrived. Customers asked to take photos with Margaret and her new patch. The pay-it-forward jar filled to overflowing as people were inspired to contribute. Around 10, the tour bus of seniors from Minnesota arrived as expected. They filed into the diner with excited chatter, each wanting to see the table and meet the waitress from the story they'd heard about. Margaret welcomed them warmly, recounting the tale once more, showing them the framed patches on the wall and the new one on her apron. "It's like something from a movie," one elderly woman said, her eyes bright with wonder. "A modern fairy tale." "No fairy tale," Ghost corrected gently from his booth. "Just human beings remembering how to see each other, how to respect each other." As the morning stretched toward noon, Margaret noticed a black SUV pull into the parking lot, the same vehicle that had brought Dale to her trailer 6 months ago. But this time, Dale wasn't behind the wheel. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s emerged from the driver's side, gray hair cut military short. Bearing that suggested command, eyes that assessed everything they saw. He was followed by a younger woman in a business suit carrying a leather portfolio. They entered the diner, pausing at the threshold to take in the scene. Ghost and Ray exchanged glances, their postures subtly shifting toward alertness. The man approached the counter where Margaret was refilling salt shakers. "Mrs. Wilson?" he inquired politely. "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "How can I help you?" The man extended his hand. "James Harrington. I represent a development group interested in speaking with you." Ghost stood immediately, moving with surprising speed for a man his size. "James Harrington of Horizon Developments," he said, his voice flat. "The company that's been buying up properties along this stretch of Route 66. The man turned, surprise flickering across his face as he recognized Ghost. "Jim Harrington," Ghost continued, "also known as Captain James Harrington, formerly of the United States Marine Corps. We served in Iraq together, 2004. Harrington's expression shifted from surprise to recognition. "Ghost," he said quietly, "it's been a long time." "Not long enough," Ghost replied, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of tension. What brings a big developer to the Last Mile Diner? Harrington turned back to Margaret, his professional demeanor returning. As I was saying, Mrs. Wilson, my company is interested in discussing a business opportunity with you. Or rather, with the owner of this establishment. He emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. That would be me, Dale Fisher. Harrington nodded cordially. Mr. Fisher, your diner has attracted considerable attention in recent months. My company specializes in revitalizing classic Americana along historic routes. We'd like to discuss the possibility of franchising the Last Mile Diner concept. A murmur ran through the restaurant. Dale looked stunned. Franchising? You mean opening more diners like this one? Exactly? The woman with the portfolio interjected, stepping forward. The story of this place has resonated with people across the country. We believe the concept could be successfully replicated in key locations along Route 66 and other historic highways. With appropriate compensation to you as the original owner, of course, Harrington added smoothly. Dale glanced at Margaret, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected proposal. I'd need to think about it, he said finally. Of course, Harrington agreed. We're prepared to make a very generous offer. He handed Dale a business card. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting to discuss details. Dale accepted the card, examining it closely. I'll call your office to set something up, he said cautiously. Harrington nodded, then turned his attention back to Margaret. And we'd be very interested in having you involved as well, Mrs. Wilson. Your personal story is integral to the diner's appeal. Margaret felt uncomfortable under his assessing gaze. I'm just a waitress, she said simply. This is Dale's business. You're far more than just a waitress, Harrington corrected. You're the heart of the story, the woman who showed kindness to the Hells Angels and received it back 1,000-fold. That narrative has marketing potential we'd be foolish to ignore. Ghost moved closer to Margaret, his presence protective without being overtly threatening. Margaret isn't a marketing tool, he said quietly. She's a person who deserves respect. Harrington glanced between Ghost and Margaret, noting the patch on her apron with raised eyebrows. I see the bonds formed that day remain strong, he observed. Fascinating. He stepped back, professional smile returning. Well, we won't take up any more of your time today. Mr. Fisher, I look forward to your call. He nodded to Margaret. Mrs. Wilson, it was a pleasure to meet you. As Harrington and his associate left the diner, conversation gradually resumed. Dale stared at the business card in his hand, expression torn between excitement and uncertainty. What do you think? He asked Margaret quietly. Margaret watched through the window as Harrington's SUV pulled away. I think there's more to that man than a business proposition, she replied, and I think Ghost knows what it is. She turned to where Ghost still stood, his eyes following the departing vehicle with unmistakable wariness. You know him, Margaret stated rather than asked. From more than just Iraq. Ghost's expression was unreadable. James Harrington has many interests, he said cryptically. Development is just one of them. Be careful, Dale. Read any contract very, very carefully. The morning's celebratory mood had been tempered by the unexpected visit. Customers began to disperse, the tour group boarding their bus for the next stop on their Route 66 adventure. The bikers remained, however, engaged in quiet conversation among themselves. Margaret returned to her duties, but questions lingered in her mind. What was the history between Ghost and James Harrington? What did Ghost know that had put him instantly on alert? And what would franchising mean for the Last Mile Diner and the community that had formed around it? By early afternoon, the lunch rush had ended, and the diner settled into its usual midday lull. Ray approached Margaret as she wiped down tables. "Ghost wants to speak with you," he said quietly. "After your shift. It's important." Margaret nodded, intrigued and slightly concerned. "Everything okay?" "Just some history you should know about," Ray replied, "given Harrington's interest in this place." When her shift ended at 3, Margaret found Ghost waiting outside beside his motorcycle. The others had already departed, leaving the two of them alone in the parking lot. "Walk with me," Ghost suggested, indicating the small park across from the diner. They crossed the street in companionable silence, finding a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. For a moment, Ghost simply sat, his weathered face contemplative, as he gazed at the Last Mile diner across the way. "James Harrington and I have a complicated history," he finally said, "one that goes back further than Iraq, though that's where it came to a head." Margaret waited patiently, sensing Ghost needed to tell this story his own way. "Before I joined the Angels, I was Force Recon, Marines. Did 4 tours, including the first Gulf War. Harrington was an intelligence officer who sometimes worked with our unit. Ambitious, ruthless when necessary. Effective." Ghost's eyes took on a distant look, seeing events from years ago. "In Iraq, 2004, our paths crossed again. I was on my last tour before retiring. Harrington was running intelligence operations in Fallujah, the same city where Mason earned his medals." His voice dropped lower. "There was an operation. Details aren't important now. But Harrington sacrificed 3 of my men to protect an asset he considered more valuable. Made a calculation that their lives were an acceptable cost." Margaret felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. Ghost acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "After I got out, I drifted, found the Brotherhood, found purpose again. Harrington went private sector. Defense contracting at first, then branched into development and other ventures." He turned to look directly at Margaret. "His company Horizon Developments has been buying properties all along Route 66. Old motels, gas stations, diners. Some they renovate as tourist attractions. Others they level for new construction. But there's always an angle beyond what's visible." "What's his angle with the Last Mile diner?" Margaret asked. Ghost shook his head. "Not sure yet, but the timing is suspicious. 6 months ago, this was just another struggling roadside diner. Now it's got national attention, a viral story, and a connection to the Hells Angels. Suddenly, Harrington appears with a franchise offer." Margaret considered this. "You think he wants to exploit the story, commercialize what happened?" "At minimum," Ghost confirmed. "But with Harrington, there's usually more beneath the surface. He's a collector of leverage, information, connections, things he can use when needed." He gestured toward the diner. "What's happened here represents something powerful. Community. Respect across boundaries. The kind of organic movement that can't be manufactured. Harrington recognizes that value, and he'll want to control it." Margaret absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the polished businessman she'd met with the calculating intelligence officer Ghost described. "What should we do?" she asked finally. Ghost's expression softened slightly. "Be vigilant. Advise Dale to proceed with extreme caution. And remember that what makes the Last Mile diner special can't be franchised or replicated. It exists because of genuine connections between real people." He stood, indicating their conversation was concluding. "The Brotherhood will be watching. Harrington knows that now. It may be enough to make him reconsider whatever he's planning." As they walked back toward the diner, Ghost added, "That patch you wear isn't just symbolic, Margaret. It means you have the protection of the Hells Angels, should you ever need it." Margaret touched the patch on her apron, which she had carefully removed, and would sew onto her regular clothes at home. "I never imagined my life would include the friendship of men like you," she admitted. "But I'm grateful it does." Ghost's serious expression gave way to a rare smile. "The feeling is mutual, Margaret Wilson." They parted at the diner, Ghost mounting his motorcycle with the fluid grace of a man who had spent decades on two wheels. "Stay safe," he said, as a farewell before roaring off down Route 66, a solitary figure against the afternoon sky. Margaret walked to her car, her mind filled with the day's events. The honorary patch ceremony, Doc's unexpected appearance, Harrington's proposal, Ghost's warnings. So much had happened since that fateful day 6 months ago when she'd torn up a check worth $67. As she drove home, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The leather bag of money had saved her from immediate financial disaster. The repairs to her home and car had provided security she hadn't known in years. David's scholarship had opened doors that once seemed permanently closed. But the most profound changes weren't material. They were in the connections formed, the community built, the hope restored. She arrived home to find David already there, working at the new desk in his room. Textbooks spread around his laptop as he prepared for his science fair project. "How was school?" Margaret asked, leaning against his door frame. David looked up, his face lighting with enthusiasm. "Great. Mr. Callahan thinks our engineering project has a shot at the state competition. If we win, there's a scholarship opportunity for the whole team." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "I have no doubt you'll win. Your father would be so proud of you." David's expression softened at the mention of Bill. "I was thinking about Dad today, about what he always said about doing the right thing even when it's hard." "He was right," Margaret agreed. "More right than I realized for a long time." David gestured to the dog tags hanging around his mother's neck. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't torn up that check that day, if you'd just let them leave without paying?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I'd still be struggling. We'd still be living paycheck to paycheck. Your college would still seem like an impossible dream." She touched Mason's dog tags thoughtfully. "And Tommy would still be lost in grief, thinking no kindness remained in the world." A single moment, David marveled. One decision changed everything. "Not just for us," Margaret added, "for the diner, for the veterans benefiting from the Mason-Jackson Fund, for everyone touched by the story." She sat on the edge of his bed. "Something interesting happened today," she said, and proceeded to tell him about the honorary patch ceremony, Harrington's visit, and Ghost's warning. David listened intently, his expression growing serious. "Do you think this Harrington guy is dangerous?" "Not physically," Margaret replied. "But Ghost clearly doesn't trust him, and Ghost's instincts seem worth heeding." "What will Dale do about the franchise offer?" Margaret shrugged. "I don't know. The money would certainly be tempting. But Dale's changed these past 6 months. He's seen firsthand how something authentic can't be mass-produced." They talked a while longer, then Margaret left David to his studies. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple dinner, her mind still processing the day's events. Her phone chimed with a text message from Dale. "Harrington called. Meeting tomorrow at 10. Could use your perspective if you can make it." Margaret replied that she would be there, then set her phone aside. Whatever Harrington was planning, it wouldn't be decided tomorrow. The Last Mile Diner had become something special, something worth protecting. And Margaret Wilson, newly minted honorary member of the Hells Angels, had no intention of letting it be exploited. The next morning dawned clear and cool. perfect Arizona autumn weather. Margaret arrived at the diner early before her scheduled shift to attend the meeting with Dale and James Harrington. She wore her regular clothes, but had carefully sewn the honorary patch onto a denim jacket, which she wore proudly. Dale was already there, uncharacteristically nervous, straightening menus that didn't need straightening and wiping down counters that were already clean. "Thanks for coming," he said when Margaret entered. "I feel out of my depth with this corporate stuff." "Happy to help," Margaret assured him. "Have you decided what you want from this meeting?" Dale hesitated. "The money would be life-changing," he admitted. "But after everything that's happened here—" He gestured around the diner at the framed patches on the wall, the pay-it-forward jar, the table reserved for respect. "I'm not sure it can be franchised. Not really." Margaret nodded, pleased that Dale understood the essence of what made the Last Mile Diner special. At precisely 10, Harrington arrived. Today, he was alone, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the modest diner. He carried a sleek leather briefcase. "Mr. Fisher, Mrs. Wilson," he greeted them formally. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." They sat at a table in the corner away from the few early customers enjoying breakfast. Harrington opened his briefcase and removed a folder of documents. "As I mentioned yesterday, Horizon Developments is very interested in franchising the Last Mile Diner concept," he began. "Our research indicates significant market potential for establishments that combine nostalgic Americana with authentic community stories." He slid a document across the table. "This is our initial proposal. 5 franchise locations to start with potential for nationwide expansion if successful. Mr. Fisher would retain ownership of this original location while licensing the name, concept, and story to Horizon for the franchise operations." Dale examined the document cautiously. "And the financial terms—" Harrington named a figure that made both Dale and Margaret blink in surprise. It was substantially more than either had expected. "That's very generous," Dale acknowledged. "But I have some concerns about how the franchises would operate. The Last Mile Diner isn't just about the food or the decor. It's about the community we've built." "Precisely why we want Mrs. Wilson involved as well," Harrington replied smoothly, turning to Margaret. "As a brand ambassador, the face of the Last Mile Diner story, your personal journey would be a central part of the marketing narrative." Margaret frowned slightly. "My personal journey isn't a marketing narrative, Mr. Harrington. It's my life." Harrington smiled, a practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Poor choice of words on my part. But surely you can see the value in sharing your experience more widely, inspiring others through what happened here." "The story is already spreading," Margaret pointed out. "Organically, authentically, through people who visit here and take something meaningful away with them." Harrington leaned forward. "But imagine the impact if we could replicate that experience in multiple locations. The pay-it-forward concept, the respect-based philosophy, the bridge building between different segments of society. Scaled up, it could transform communities across America." His words were compelling, painting a picture of positive change on a national scale. But Margaret remembered Ghost's warning. With Harrington, there was always more beneath the surface. "What's your real interest in the Last Mile Diner, Mr. Harrington?" she asked directly. "Beyond the obvious business opportunity." Harrington paused, studying Margaret with new appreciation. "Ghost has been talking to you," he stated rather than asked. "I should have expected that." "He mentioned you have history," Margaret acknowledged, "and that your business interests often have multiple layers." For a moment, Harrington's polished veneer slipped, revealing something harder beneath. Then the professional smile returned. "My interest is exactly what I've stated. A successful business opportunity with the potential for positive social impact. He gathered his documents, sensing the meeting wasn't going as planned. "I understand you need time to consider the proposal. I'll leave these materials for your review." He handed Dale a business card. "My direct line. Call when you're ready to discuss further." As Harrington stood to leave, he paused, looking at the honorary patch on Margaret's jacket. "Interesting accessory," he commented. "I wouldn't have expected the Hells Angels to bestow such an honor on an outsider." "I'm not an outsider to them," Margaret replied simply. Harrington nodded, as if filing away this information for future reference. "Good day, Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Fisher." He departed with the same smooth efficiency with which he had arrived. Dale let out a long breath once Harrington was gone. "What do you think?" he asked Margaret, gesturing to the proposal documents left on the table. Margaret considered her response carefully. "I think Ghost is right to be cautious. The offer is extremely generous, which makes me wonder what Harrington stands to gain that isn't outlined in that proposal." Dale nodded slowly. "The money would set me up for retirement," he admitted. "But this place has become something more than just a business to me." He looked around at the diner, at the customers enjoying their breakfast, at the wall of memories documenting the extraordinary events of 6 months ago. "After that day with the Hells Angels, I started seeing things differently, seeing people differently." He met Margaret's eyes. "Seeing you differently." "We've all changed," Margaret agreed. "And that's what can't be franchised. The authentic connections, the real community, the respect that's earned, not manufactured." Dale gathered Harrington's proposal and placed it in a drawer behind the counter. "I won't be calling him today," he decided. "Or tomorrow. This place is special just as it is." Margaret smiled, relieved. "I think that's the right decision." She began her regular shift, the rhythms of the diner familiar and comforting after the tension of the meeting. Regulars came and went. The pay-it-forward jar collected more contributions. Mr. Henderson arrived for his weekly visit, telling his USO story for the 100th time, while Margaret listened as if hearing it anew. Around noon, Margaret's phone vibrated with a text message from Ray. "Ghost says watch Harrington. He doesn't take rejection well. Brothers are nearby if needed." Margaret glanced out the window, noticing for the first time a few motorcycles parked across the street, their riders seemingly casual but watchful. The Brotherhood was keeping its promise of protection. The day proceeded without incident, however. By closing time, Margaret was ready to head home, looking forward to a quiet evening with David, who had texted that he was making dinner for a change. As she walked to her car, Margaret noticed a paper tucked under the windshield wiper. Not an advertisement or flyer, but a plain white envelope with her name written in elegant script. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a business card for James Harrington, with a handwritten note on the back. "Mrs. Wilson, I respect your loyalty to the diner and to your biker friends, but I urge you to consider my proposal independently. Your story deserves a wider audience, and I can provide that platform. My offer stands brand ambassador with very generous compensation. Think about what that could mean for your son's future. Call me directly when you're ready to discuss. Some opportunities don't come twice. J.I." Margaret stared at the card for a long moment, then slipped it into her pocket. Harrington was clearly not a man who gave up easily, and his mention of David felt vaguely like leverage being applied subtly professionally, but unmistakably. When she arrived home, David greeted her with unexpected news. "Mom, guess what? I got a call from Arizona State University today. They want to interview me for an early admission scholarship program." Margaret hugged him, genuinely thrilled. "That's wonderful. "When's the interview?" "Next Wednesday," David replied excitedly. "They specifically mentioned my work with veterans' kids. Said it showed exactly the kind of community leadership they're looking for." As David continued sharing details about the opportunity, Margaret's thoughts drifted to Harrington's note. Some opportunities don't come twice. The timing of this scholarship interview seemed almost too perfect, given Harrington's earlier mention of David's future. Could Harrington have connections at Arizona State? Was this legitimate opportunity or subtle manipulation? Margaret pushed the suspicion aside, unwilling to dampen David's excitement. Whatever Harrington's game was, she wouldn't let it affect her son's achievements. David had earned this opportunity through his own merit and hard work. That evening, as David slept, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Harrington's business card before her. The offer was tempting on its surface. Financial security, national recognition, a platform to share a story that had already proven its power to inspire. But Ghost's warning echoed in her mind. With Harrington, there was always more beneath the surface, always an angle beyond what was visible. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed not the number on Harrington's card, but Ray's. When he answered, his voice was alert despite the late hour. "Everything okay, Margaret?" "I need advice," she replied, then proceeded to tell him about Harrington's note and David's sudden scholarship opportunity. Ray listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "Ghost predicted this," he finally said. "Harrington's applying pressure points, testing where your vulnerabilities lie." "What should I do?" Margaret asked. "Nothing yet," Ray advised. "Let David pursue the scholarship. It may be legitimate regardless of Harrington's involvement. As for the offer, Ghost would say to ignore it. Any engagement gives Harrington information he can use." After they hung up, Margaret made her decision. She tore Harrington's card into tiny pieces and threw them away. Whatever game the developer was playing, she refused to be a pawn in it. The Last Mile Diner's story belonged to those who had lived it, not to those who sought to profit from it. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work to find an unexpected visitor waiting. Tommy sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee, his young face unusually serious. "Morning, Tommy," Margaret greeted him warmly. "You're here early." "Needed to talk to you," he replied. "About Harrington." Margaret tied on her apron the honorary patch prominently displayed. "What about him?" Tommy glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "He approached me yesterday, offered me a job with his company, said they need veterans for a special project related to the Last Mile Diner franchises." Margaret's concern deepened. "Harrington's targeting everyone connected to the diner's story." "Ghost said to tell you," Tommy continued. "Said Harrington's building a web trying to control all the elements that made this place special." Margaret nodded her understanding. "Thank you for the warning, Tommy. Did you accept his offer?" Tommy shook his head emphatically. "No way. I don't trust the man. Besides, I've got something better now." His expression brightened. "The Mason Jackson Fund has partnered with the VA to create a peer support program for veterans with PTSD. They've asked me to help coordinate it." Pride swelled in Margaret's chest. "Tommy, that's wonderful. Your father would be so proud." "That's what Ghost said." Tommy agreed, his eyes reflecting both grief and purpose. "It's like Dad's still helping people, you know, through this program. Through me." Margaret touched Mason's dog tags around her neck. "He is Tommy. Through all of us." As Tommy departed, Margaret reflected on how the ripples from that fateful day continued to spread outward, touching lives in ways she could never have anticipated. From a simple torn check to a nationwide support program for veterans. From 5 hungry bikers to a community united across traditional boundaries. Whatever James Harrington was planning, He couldn't replicate that authentic impact. He could build franchises that looked like the Last Mile Diner, but he couldn't manufacture the heart of what had happened here. The day progressed normally until mid-afternoon, when Dale approached Margaret with an envelope. "This came for you," he said, his expression troubled. Courier delivered it personally. Margaret opened it to find a formal letter on Horizon Development's letterhead. The contents made her blood run cold. "Dear Mrs. Wilson," it began, "our research has uncovered some concerning information regarding the property where your trailer is located. It appears the land is scheduled for rezoning as part of a commercial development project. As the current residents would be displaced, we wanted to offer our assistance in securing alternative housing arrangements. Horizon Developments would be pleased to provide relocation assistance in exchange for your cooperation with our Last Mile Diner franchise initiative. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss this mutually beneficial arrangement. Sincerely, James Harrington." The implication was clear: cooperate or lose your home. Margaret handed the letter to Dale, who read it with growing alarm. "This is blackmail," he said when he finished. "Thinly veiled, but blackmail nonetheless." "He's escalating," Margaret agreed, "testing how far he can push." She took out her phone and called Ray, explaining the latest development. His response was immediate and definitive. "Don't engage. Ghost is handling it." "Handling it how?" Margaret asked, concerned. "The Brotherhood way," Ray replied cryptically. "Harrington may have corporate power, but Ghost has connections too. Very different ones." That evening, as Margaret drove home, she noticed a black SUV following her. Not Harrington's vehicle, but similar. It maintained a consistent distance, never drawing too close, but never falling too far behind. Alarmed, Margaret took a deliberate wrong turn. The SUV followed. She made another unexpected change of direction. Still, the vehicle remained behind her. Heart racing, Margaret pulled into a gas station and quickly called "I'm being followed," she reported, giving her location. "Stay where you are," Ray instructed. "Brothers are en route." Within minutes, 3 motorcycles roared into the gas station, positioning themselves protectively around Margaret's car. The black SUV, seeing this development, drove past without stopping. Bear Wolf and a third biker Margaret didn't recognize approached her window. "You okay?" Bear asked, his imposing size somehow reassuring rather than intimidating. Margaret nodded, still shaken. "Who was that? Harrington's people?" "Probably Wolf," confirmed. "Taking surveillance photos. Standard intimidation tactic." "We'll escort you home," Bear decided, "and keep watch overnight. Ghost's orders." Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions: fear at being targeted, anger at Harrington's tactics, gratitude for the Brotherhood's protection, and beneath it all, a growing determination not to be intimidated. The bikers formed a protective formation around her car, one leading 2 following as they escorted her home. When they arrived at the trailer park, 2 more motorcycles were already there, their riders watchful sentinels. The bikers formed a protective formation around Margaret's car, one leading 2 following as they escorted her home. When they arrived at the trailer park, 2 more motorcycles were already there, their riders watchful sentinels. David rushed out when he heard the engine's alarm visible on his face. "Mom! What's going on?" Margaret climbed out of her car, trying to appear calm despite the circumstances. "Just a precaution, honey. Some friends making sure I got home safely." Bear approached, removing his helmet. "We'll have riders here all night. 2 in front, 2 in back. Nothing to worry about." Margaret nodded gratefully, though worry still gnawed at her. She had expected resistance from Harrington after refusing his offer, but this level of intimidation suggested something more sinister at work. "Come inside, both of you," she invited Bear and Wolf. "I was about to make dinner." over a simple meal of spaghetti and garlic bread. Margaret explained the situation to David while the bikers listened silently, occasionally exchanging glances. "So, this Harrington guy basically threatened to have us evicted if you don't cooperate with his franchise plans." David summarized, his voice tight with indignation. "That's the gist of it," Margaret confirmed. Bear set down his fork. "Ghost wants to meet with you tomorrow. Both of you. He thinks it's time to settle this." "Settle it how?" Margaret asked. "The Brotherhood way," Wolf replied, "by confronting the threat head-on." That night, Margaret slept fitfully, despite the reassuring presence of the Hells Angels outside. Harrington's escalating tactics suggested a man used to getting his way, a man for whom business was merely a veneer covering darker motivations. Morning arrived with a text from Ghost. "Meeting at Chapter House, 10 a.m. Ray will escort you." Margaret and David were ready when Ray arrived at 9, his weathered face serious as he led them to his truck rather than his motorcycle. "Too conspicuous today," he explained, starting the engine. "Harrington's people are watching." The Arizona chapter house of the Hells Angels was nothing like Margaret had imagined. Located in an industrial area on the outskirts of Phoenix, the building looked like a nondescript warehouse from the outside. Inside, however, it revealed itself as a meticulously maintained headquarters with a large common room offices and a separate garage area where mechanics worked on motorcycles. Ghost waited for them in a room that seemed to function as a conference area, maps and framed patches decorating the walls. Tommy Bear, Wolf, and Doc were already seated around a large table. "Thank you for coming," Ghost said, rising to greet Margaret and David. His scar, which ran along his right cheek, looked more pronounced in the fluorescent lighting. "What I'm about to share goes beyond club business. It's about Harrington and what he really wants." Ghost gestured to a laptop set up at the head of the table. "We have a friend in digital intelligence, former NSA. He's been looking into Horizon developments and their activities along Route 66. He pressed a key, and the screen filled with documents, property records, and news articles. "Harrington's been buying properties along a specific corridor for the past 3 years. Motels, diners, gas stations. Some he renovates as tourist attractions, but many just sit empty." "Wait," David asked, leaning forward with interest. "This," Ghost replied, clicking to a new image. A map appeared showing a proposed highway expansion. "Department of Transportation plans for a new interstate connector. Not public yet, but certain contractors already know. Land values along this route will quadruple once the announcement is made." Margaret studied the map, noting how the last-mile diner sat at a key junction. "So the franchise offer is just a cover. He really wants the land." "Partly," Ghost agreed. "But there's more." He clicked again, revealing a series of financial documents. "Horizon Developments is a shell. Majority ownership belongs to Sentinel Global." "The defense contractor?" David asked, surprising both Margaret and Ghost with his knowledge. Ghost nodded. "Harrington's using his development company to acquire properties and influence along strategic transportation corridors, military supply routes, evacuation pathways. It's about national security infrastructure disguised as commercial development." "And our story?" Margaret asked. "The Brotherhood Code, the pay-it-forward movement." "A marketing goldmine," Ray interjected. "Authentic American values, community spirit, respect across social boundaries. Perfect cover for what's really a strategic acquisition program." Ghost's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression darkening. "Harrington's on the move. He's at the diner right now talking to Dale." Margaret stood immediately. "We need to go. Dale doesn't know what he's dealing with." "Exactly what I was thinking," Ghost replied. "But we do this carefully. No violence, no threats. Just the truth exposed in the light of day. 20 minutes later, they arrived at the Last Mile Diner to find Harrington's black SUV parked prominently out front. Inside, Harrington sat with Dale at a corner table, legal documents spread between them. Linda hovered nearby, clearly trying to overhear their conversation. Ghost entered first, his presence commanding immediate attention. The few customers present fell silent, sensing the tension. Ray and Tommy flanked Margaret and David as they followed Ghost toward Harrington's table. Harrington looked up, his polished facade briefly slipping to reveal annoyance before the professional smile returned. "Ah, Mrs. Wilson. And Ghost. What a surprise." "No surprise, Jim," Ghost replied, his raspy voice carrying in the quiet diner. "You've been pushing all the right buttons, forcing this confrontation." Dale looked confused, glancing between Harrington and the newcomers. "Margaret, what's going on? Show him what you're really signing, Dale," Ghost said, nodding toward the documents. "Tell him about Sentinel Global, about the highway plans, about how his diner sits on land that will be worth millions once the DOT announcement goes public." Harrington's expression hardened. "You've been digging, Ghost. Some might call that corporate espionage, and others might call what you're doing exploitation," Margaret countered, finding her voice. "Using our story, the Brotherhood Code, the pay-it-forward movement, as cover for a land grab." Harrington stood gathering his documents with efficient movements. "I'm offering a legitimate business opportunity, Mrs. Wilson, one that would benefit everyone involved." "Everyone except the community that's grown around this place," Margaret replied. "This isn't just a business, Mr. Harrington. It's become something more important. Something real." Ghost moved closer, his voice low but intense. "Tell them about Fallujah Jim, about the 3 men you sacrificed for your greater good, about how you've built your empire on calculated losses." For a moment, the professional mask fell away completely, revealing a cold, calculating intelligence that sent a chill through Margaret. "Still fighting old wars, Ghost. Some battles can't be won on principles alone. Progress requires sacrifices." "Not these sacrifices," Margaret stated firmly. "Not the Last Mile Diner. Not what we've built here." Dale stood now, his expression hardening with resolve Margaret had never seen before. "I think you should leave, Mr. Harrington. I won't be signing anything today, or any other day." Harrington assessed the room, noting the silent support for Margaret and Dale. Even the customers were watching, some holding up phones recording the confrontation. Finally, he nodded once acknowledgement rather than surrender. "This isn't over," he said quietly to Ghost. "Some opportunities are too valuable to simply walk away from. And some principles are too important to compromise," Ghost replied. "Remember that." As Harrington departed, the tension in the diner slowly dissipated. Dale looked at the documents on the table with new suspicion. "He was going to pay $2 million for franchise rights," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I almost signed. The land alone will be worth 5 times that once the highway plans go public," Ghost explained. "He was buying at a discount." Margaret sat heavily in a chair, the adrenaline of confrontation leaving her drained. Will he really give up just like that? Ghost shook his head. No, but he'll change tactics. And now that everything's in the open, his options are limited. The Brotherhood will keep watch. This isn't just about business anymore. It's about protecting what matters. In the days that followed, Margaret noticed subtle changes. The surveillance stopped. The pressure eased. Life began returning to normal, though a certain wariness remained. The bikers maintained their protective presence, rotating shifts to ensure someone was always watching over the diner and Margaret's home. One morning, 2 weeks after the confrontation, Margaret arrived at work to find an official-looking envelope waiting. Inside was a brief letter from the Department of Transportation confirming that the Last Mile Diner had been designated a historical landmark under the Route 66 Preservation Act, protecting it from future development or demolition. Attached was a handwritten note from Ghost. "Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Harrington's not the only one with connections." That afternoon, Tommy arrived with exciting news. The Mason-Jackson Memorial Fund had secured major corporate sponsorship, expanding its reach nationwide. "We've helped 27 families so far," he reported proudly. "Veterans' kids who couldn't afford college. Dad would have loved seeing this." David's scholarship interview had gone exceptionally well. Arizona State University had offered him early admission with a full academic scholarship. "They specifically mentioned my support group for veterans' kids," he told Margaret, eyes bright with excitement. "Said it showed exactly the kind of community leadership they were looking for." As winter turned to spring, the Last Mile Diner continued to thrive. The Pay It Forward movement had spread to other establishments along Route 66, creating a chain of community-focused businesses where kindness and respect were the currency of choice. Dale, transformed by the events of the past months, had emerged as an unexpected champion of this approach. "It's not just good karma," he'd explained to skeptical business owners. "It's good business. People want authenticity. They want connection. They want to be part of something that matters." And April 9th marked 1 year since the day Margaret had torn up the check worth $67.38. 1 year since she had shown respect to 5 grieving bikers when others had shown only fear. The Last Mile Diner closed early that day, preparing for a private celebration. By evening, the parking lot filled with motorcycles and cars as people gathered to commemorate what had become known locally as Respect Day. The diner had been transformed with streamers and balloons. A banner stretched across one wall, the Brotherhood Code 1 year later. Beneath it hung the shadow box containing the original 5 patches, alongside photos documenting the extraordinary journey of the past year. As people arrived, Margaret greeted them at the door, Mason's dog tags still hanging around her neck, the honorary member patch prominently displayed on her jacket. David stood beside her, tall and confident, his future now secure. Ghost arrived with the other original participants, Ray, Tommy Bearwolf, and Doc. They each embraced Margaret, the formality of their first meeting replaced by the easy affection of family. "How are you holding up, Doc?" Margaret asked, noting how the hollowness had receded from his eyes over the months. "One day at a time," he replied honestly. "Some days are still hard, but I'm keeping my promise to Sophia, living for both of us now." The celebration encompassed far more than just the original participants. Mrs. Peterson, once terrified of the bikers, now chatted comfortably with Ruth about their shared interest in desert gardening. Mr. Henderson, the retired judge with dementia, sat at a table of honor, occasionally retelling his USO story to anyone who would listen. Dale had prepared a feast, enlisting the help of professional caterers for the occasion. As people filled their plates and found seats, Ghost tapped a glass for attention. "A year ago today," he began, his raspy voice somehow carrying over the crowd, "a waitress at a struggling diner made a choice. She chose to see beyond appearances, to show respect when others showed fear, to honor a man she had never met through kindness to those who mourned him." He raised his glass. That choice set in motion events none of us could have predicted. It created ripples that continue to spread outward, touching lives far beyond this small corner of Arizona. Tommy stepped forward, standing tall beside Ghost. "My father struggled with demons most people never see," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion in his eyes. "The war came home with him, and eventually it took him from us. But through what happened here, through the fund that bears his name, his legacy has become something bigger than his pain. He gestured to a group of young people seated together near the back. These are scholarship recipients from the Mason Jackson Memorial Fund, children of veterans who now have opportunities they might never have had. All because Margaret Wilson tore up a check and said, "It's on the house." David spoke next, his confidence growing with each public appearance. "My dad used to say that the good you do returns to you, maybe not how you expect, but it always returns," he shared. For years after he died, my mom and I struggled. There were times when that saying seemed like wishful thinking, but now I understand what he meant. He smiled at Margaret's love and pride, evident in his expression. The good returns multiplied. It grows, it spreads, and it changes things in ways we can't imagine when we're making those small choices that seem insignificant at the time. Finally, Margaret rose to speak. She looked around at the gathering. Bikers in leather vests, neighbors who had once feared them, customers who had become friends, recipients of the kindness that had begun in this very room.
"A year ago, I did something very simple," she said. "I showed respect to 5 men who were grieving. I didn't know then about the Brotherhood Code. I didn't know about debts being paid. I just knew that in that moment, kindness mattered more than money." She touched the dog tags around her neck. "What happened afterward was extraordinary. 800 Hell's Angels surrounded my home. My car was fixed, my trailer repaired, my financial burdens eased. But the most profound change wasn't material." Margaret paused, finding the right words. "The most important thing that happened was that we all remembered how to see each other, really see each other, beyond the patches and the uniforms and the labels society applies. We remembered that beneath the surface, judgments and assumptions, there exists the potential for connection, for understanding, for respect." She raised her glass. "To the Brotherhood Code, to respect given and received, to kindness that ripples outward, and to Mason Jackson, whose legacy continues to grow through all of us. To Mason!" The crowd echoed, glasses raised. As the evening continued, Margaret found herself momentarily alone, watching the diverse gathering with quiet wonder. Ghost appeared beside her, his weathered face reflective. "What you started here goes beyond any of us now," he said. "It's become its own force." Margaret nodded. "I never expected any of this. I just did what seemed right in the moment." "That's how the most important things begin," Ghost replied. "Not with grand gestures, but with simple choices made from the heart." They stood in companionable silence, watching as David and Tommy engaged in animated conversation with scholarship recipients, as Dale proudly showed off the diner's memorial wall to newcomers, as Doc laughed genuinely at something Ruth had said. "Harrington's company announced a strategic restructuring yesterday," Ghost mentioned casually. "He's been reassigned to their European division, effective immediately." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You're doing," Ghost smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say certain government agencies became very interested in his acquisition patterns once they were pointed out by the right people. Some battles are fought openly, others happen behind the scenes." As the celebration wound down, guests began departing with hugs and promises to return. The 5 original bikers remained until the end, helping with cleanup despite Margaret's protests. "Brotherhood Code," Ray reminded her with a wink. "We pay our debts, always." "I think that debt has been paid many times over," Margaret replied, smiling. Tommy shook his head. "Some debts can never be fully repaid, Margaret. What you did that day,
You gave me back my voice when grief had stolen it. You showed me that good still exists in the world when I was ready to give up on humanity.
That's not something that can be repaid with money or repairs.
It's repaid by living differently, Doc added quietly. By carrying forward what you taught us. By remembering to see people as they truly are, not as they appear on the surface. As the last motorcycle rumbled away into the night, Margaret and David stood together outside the Last Mile Diner, its neon sign casting a warm glow in the desert darkness. "Do you think Dad knows?" David asked, echoing the question he had posed a year earlier. "About everything that's happened." Margaret put her arm around her son's shoulders, feeling the strength in him that reminded her so much of Bill. "I think he does," she said softly. "And I think he's proud of the man you're becoming." They walked to her perfectly running Chevy, ready to head home to their renovated trailer. As they drove, Margaret reflected on how completely their lives had transformed in a single year. The financial security, the educational opportunities, the community built. But most importantly, the hope restored. The Brotherhood Code had become more than just a rule of conduct for an outlaw motorcycle club. It had evolved into a philosophy that was spreading across their corner of Arizona and beyond. Respect given freely returns multiplied. Kindness matters more than money. And sometimes, the simple act of tearing up a check can change the world. In the Brotherhood Code, debts were always paid. Always. But what began as a debt had become something far more significant. It had become a movement. A reminder that beneath the surface of judgments and assumptions, there exists the potential for connection. All it takes is one person willing to see past appearances to the humanity beneath. One person like Margaret Wilson.